Thank you so much. You know what, to help with this transition, what I'm going to do is actually get you a little bit loosened up. And the way I'm going to do that is a little survey test. I'd like everybody who actually uses a PC to please stand up. Okay. There's our PC users. Okay, sit down. Thank you. Now, everybody who uses a Mac, please stand up. Wow, that's really interesting. That's about 50-50. I always like to do that. It helps you sort of gauge the room a little bit towards us from the West Coast, who I think are a little Mac biased, as it turns out. But first of all, I want to just sort of thank everybody for coming out here today. This is really a great group of people. I mean, many of you, I admire your work. I've read your work. I've learned from your work. And I really appreciate this incredible setting that they brought us out to as well. That ocean right behind us. And quite frankly, for this treat, all they said is, be provocative, be quick, and don't use PowerPoint. So I'm not going to do any of those things. We're going to sort of launch right on in. But just a quick case in point to Alan's last story. My son, it turns out, we came home one day, sort of what we use a computer for, and we caught him, found his neighbor's guitar, and was actually teaching himself blues riffs off of YouTube. We didn't even have a guitar in the house. 3 years later, he is a really talented blues musician. It is quite an amazing thing to watch. And so to have this generation sort of growing up and actually beginning to teach themselves their own interest off of YouTube was a real stunning revelation for my wife and I. And it sort of fits into my theme. If we could go ahead and bring up that slide, please. This is a slide done by John Bransford up at University of Washington for something called the Life Learning Center. And what he's illustrating here is, if you look at sort of the yellow, the gold, those are the percentage of hours during a waking day that somebody of that particular age is actually in formal learning setting, a place called school. Okay? What stuns you, of course, is the sea of blue. This is amazing that even at your peak, when you're in a K through 12, that's the 18.5% in there, 4/5 of your day is not in a place called school, of your waking hours. And what this particular center is doing, it's a large center funded by the National Science Foundation, and what they're doing is quite radical. They're actually following learners around 7/24 to see how they actually learn. Because kids are learning machines. We're all learning machines, but what are we learning at different points in time? And so it's regardless of what institution you're part of. Let's follow the kids learning around. And what they're discovering is some amazing things. For instance, one thing that they're learning is that one of my favorite subjects, as you might know, coming from the Exploratorium, is science and what they call STEM learning. And a typical kid will get 1,000 hours of exposure to science their entire K-12 school career. During that same period, they're getting about 3,000 hours of exposure to science out of school. So already they're getting three times more the dose of science out of school than they're getting in the in-school environment. And where are they getting it? They're getting it from places like the internet, TV, visits to museums and zoo and aquaria, in after school, from their parents, from their peers, from lots of other places. And we have yet to sort of figure out how do we take advantage of this other sea of blue to really enhance people's learning. Another thing we've learned from a study that was done in 2002 by AIR for the Pew Interest in New Life in the Media, they asked the question, well, how do kids use technology in school? And their conclusion when they came back after sort of following students around as well, doing many focus groups and surveys of actual students, so to forget the adults for a second, what they found out is they completely asked the wrong question. Instead, they should have asked, how are kids using technology for school? Because they're not using it in school. And they're not using it in school for some very specific reasons. The most important one was that the teachers weren't using it authentically. The teachers weren't using the technology in school the way they were using technology for school in the after-school hours out there. It had too many filters. Teachers really didn't know what they wanted to do. You couldn't get access. There was all sorts of reasons why kids waited until they got out of school to start using the technology. And then how did they use it? Hey, Susie, how did you do on problem number 11 in chemistry? What did you do there? Or what's our homework again? Geez, I'm getting some bum advice from my counselor. What's UW-Madison really like? Because I'm thinking about going to school there. It turns out that the kids were using the internet for several different things, everything from a virtual backpack to replacing the high school, college guidance counselor. And they were getting a lot better information from their friends and from the community than they were from their in-school sources. So, one of the things I wanted to ask ourselves as learning designers, as people with bold ideas, is if suddenly we stop thinking about learning being institutional dependent, but there's important stuff we want children to learn, then how are all the ways that we could actually organize this total learning ecology, this total STEM learning ecology? You can think of it as a total learning ecosystem to support kids' learning in really interesting and important ways. So one of the models that a very good colleague of mine, Sherry Shee, has suggested is a 4x3 model. What if we completely changed the school day? What if we said 4 hours, 4 hours, 4 hours? The first 4 hours, 9 to 1 o'clock, you actually go to some place that's called school. The school may look different than it currently does, but that's really the school time. And then the second 4 hours, you actually went to this ancillary system and spent 4 hours in places like museums, or after-school centers, or public libraries, or places like the tech shop, and other community resources where you still continue to learn, but it was more semi-structured. And then the last 4 hours, actually, from 5 to 9, you let them do what every adult does, which is after a hard work day, you go home and do what you want to do. You actually give a chance for kids to sort of rest and sort of independently discover that they want to be a blues musician because they tripped over this great video of Robert Johnson on YouTube. And a way like that. And what if you sort of thought about differentiating those a little bit? That in school, disciplinary knowledge, at least a thin core, as Jeremy Michelle calls it, is still important. It's still essential. And that's what schools are there to help you with. Maybe in different ways, but it's still important that there is this notion of accumulation of knowledge within the disciplines that we need to pay attention to. So maybe it was 2 parts disciplinary knowledge, 1 part project learning, and 1 part independent study. But then in that middle third, those middle 4 hours, it was 2 parts project learning and 1 part disciplinary learning and 1 part independent study. And then at home, maybe it's 2 parts independent study and 1 part disciplinary knowledge, 1 part project learning. But you actually started to differentiate so that all those things that are important, we think, the learning of that thin core, the project-based learning and integrating those things that you're learning into meaningful things to you, this chance for independent study to follow your own passions and your own loves, was really possible within a school day. And I'll go back to that thin core for a second because I know many of you are really project-based and problem-based curricula designers, and I think that's a really critically important part. But in the end, it can't replace some of at least that thin core in school that we've talked about. There are certain things we know, for instance, in mathematics, like this notion of which is more, equivalency. It turns out this notion of which is more, 6 or 8, 10 or 2, is a really important thing for a kindergartner to understand before they leave because it has a high predictive value of where they're going to be by 3rd grade in mathematics, whether you have it or not. Another great one would be the difference between bivariate relationships and multivariate relationships. That turns out to be a really important pre-adolescent skill for most kids, and it's really important for understanding something like systems, which Alan talked about, because up to that point, A causes B, right? I do this, that happens. And that's how most of us like to think. And they discovered this actually with a study of Sim City, that when you lower taxes, the city goes green for a while. Anybody play that game? You got a few Sim City players out there? What happens after a little while, though? You lower taxes, it goes green, and then the town goes brown again. And at some point, about pre-adolescence, early adolescence, kids realize, oh, geez, it's not just that A causes B, but there's this thing called C, D, and E out there. So what are those other variables that I need to get a hold of to kind of keep this system stable and moving and alive? So it isn't just A causes B, but A only causes B if C's present and D's not. And there's a little bit of E. Or what are these other sort of relationships are. And so you can see how understanding like that does become important for something like understanding climate change, where we're talking about really complicated systems. So it is still important to worry about the accumulation of some knowledge, and there is, I think, still an important place called school. But might how school look different under this system? So let me just suggest a couple of things. First is that I really do predict that this notion about differentiated teacher pay will solve itself. And the way it'll solve itself is if you have particularly really gifted teachers who can explain in lecture format or through video really important ideas, let's say in sixth grade algebra, getting kids ready for the algebra they'll face in 8th grade. They're going to use the net to become net superstars. And that we'll discover that really talented teachers are going to figure out that they can make more money selling the services over the internet than staying within a particular classroom in a particular school district. Does that remove the need for an in-classroom teacher? Absolutely not. Because getting someone started in a subject is just the beginning, but then what do you do once you sort of get an overview of a particularly important notion? I think what happens is that what we're really looking at is all of us having our own learning coaches and teachers becoming learning managers. That if this is something you really want to learn, then let me help you learn it. Here's how we get started, but let me bring all the resources that I have, not a classroom, what if we called them studios? All these resources we have in our studio to help you learn that. And to begin to customize learning around real active managers, the way that some of us have had life coaches or other kinds of coaches or football coaches to help us continue to develop and grow in the places where we need to be, both individually and to work with a team. I think this also really challenges our notion of what is equity. In fact, I think this is one of the most problematic parts of any vision of the future and kind of thinking forward. If equity isn't producing a standard student, and by a standard student, I mean requiring every student to work lockstep through a prescribed curriculum that every kid gets no matter where they are, who they are, or what they're interested in, such as the last 20 years of the standards movement has suggested, so that we can be sure that every kid gets the same stuff, whether they got it or not, to produce a standard student at the end. Equity is so important, and I was one of those people who really believed that that was the only surefire way to make sure that everybody had equal access to the learning opportunities. And I'm really beginning to rethink my own position on that, and starting to realize that that standard student doesn't in fact ensure equity because of how many people cash out because they're completely disengaged with the system long before they get to the end of it, including my son. But if we really think more broadly about that time for everybody learning that thin core, some opportunities for some real project-based learning, whether it's in school or out of school, and that long tail, that place for individual interests to really bubble forward, that maybe then what we have at the end is not a standard student who knew the exact same thing that every other student is supposed to learn, or not, but in fact, kids who find their passions and know enough to really pursue them in depth and with love. Thank you.